History is full of amazing stories and memorable people.
But we don't care about them.
No hits, deep tracks only.
Some of the most influential people in the world have been completely overlooked or just plain forgotten.
We're digging deep into the history books to bring you their stories.
And maybe some laughs along the way.
This is History's B-Side.
Today's B-Sider is The True Inventor of Monopoly.
So Phil, if I asked you what you thought, someone like Warren Buffett or maybe Donald Trump or any capitalist's favorite board game was, what would be your guess?
Chutes and Ladders.
You're going to make this tough, aren't you? You wouldn't
It's
say,
like the stock market.
Monopoly?
You climb up and then you slide down quickly.
You don't think they'd choose a game where you could dominate your opponents and crush them financially until they were so dry and destitute that they had to jump out of the game and watch you win?
I just don't see Donald Trump playing Risk. It seems like there's too much mental capacity involved.
We wouldn't play Risk. Don't you think he'd play Monopoly?
Well, what do you need fake money when you got all that real money for?
Fair enough. But would you be
Although
surprised?
He may not have a lot of real money himself.
See, exactly. He would want... I think he would enjoy winning the game. I don't think he would enjoy losing the game.
Yeah, of course.
But what if I told you that the true inventor of Monopoly, usually unrecognized by the game itself, in fact, had political views closer to Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders than Donald Trump?
That would be surprising.
Well, today we're going to talk about Elizabeth or Lizzie Magie, who, while vastly unrecognized for her contribution to the game we know of as Monopoly today, invented the game almost 30 years before the credited inventor. And we could talk a little bit about whether or not that was, an unfair, I guess, circumstance, because her game, as we'll see, was a bit different. It wasn't exactly as it is today, but it is pretty easy to see how a lot of components were directly influenced, if not just plain old plagiarized from her game. But to start off, let's get a fair background. I'm sure most of our listeners have played the game, but if you haven't, it's essentially a game of, it basically describes our modern capitalist system in the realm of real estate, where you purchase various lots around the board. As you purchase them, other players begin to pay you rent. And this is a very simplified, there's dozens of other rules, but as other players begin to need to pay you rent, you start to make money. And the higher value the property you buy, the higher the rent is. And thus it kind of leads in this funnel effect towards one or two players having more money and eventually one player dominating the game. And the point of the game at present is really to be the last one standing. Kind of a king of the hill.
It's often described as a game that highlights the issues that we see in capitalism.
Sure. And that is one of the intended purposes of its original inventor. And I think to a certain degree it's credited inventor Charles Darrow, whose story we'll get to in a minute. But just some Monopoly fast facts for everybody. It's a vastly popular game. It's been published in over 47 languages in 114 countries. There are, as I'm sure most people know, hundreds of different versions. There's versions for every sports team, every professional sports team that you could know, most college sports teams. There's versions in many different countries, which actually do reflect the places of their countries. There's a Parisian version. There's a London version.
And those have the properties or streets that you'd find in Paris or London?
They do. As the original, I guess, quote unquote, original game reflects the streets of Atlantic City. But there's so many different versions that we could probably do an entire episode just on the different versions.
That's probably something a lot of people don't even know, is that all of the streets in the traditional Monopoly board game are actual streets in Atlantic City.
Yeah, and so as the stories get a little bit crossed, Charles Darrow had spent a lot of time at Atlantic City, and for the rest of the episode, so people know until we get to his story, Charles Darrow is the main one people think of when you think of the inventor of Monopoly. He's been featured in the actual game and as part of the kind of a history pamphlet given with the board game. And he's credited on numerous websites and historical sites and sources as being its inventor, and was the only known person to have thought of the game until the 1970s, as we'll see. But he said he had spent a lot of time there, but it also happened Lizzie Magie's version of the game, I should say, was very popular with a group of Quakers that lived in Atlantic City, which is another part of the reason people think it ended up with those street names.
You don't think of Quakers as being the big capitalistic, business-minded people that would, enjoy or create the game of Monopoly.
No, but early, and again, this is going to tie in when we discuss Lizzie's vision for the game. They were, kind of a more progressive-minded religious group, and that, as we'll see, fit into the groups that generally liked to play this game early on, before it was a nationwide and a global success. So in those hundreds of different versions, I found a few that I thought were a little bit special to me, at least, just because I thought they were cool stories or myself thought they would be fun to play. So the first is the most expensive version ever. Of course, a game that is based around making money is going to eventually have, an extravagant version itself, and it's tops out at $2 million. It was created by
Monopoly
jeweler.
itself benefits from capitalism.
Of course. So jeweler Sidney Mobell from San Francisco built this game in 1988. It's made from 23-karat gold, rubies, and sapphires atop the chimneys of the solid gold houses and hotels. And the dice have 42 full-cut diamonds for spots. It's not
That's
something
amazing.
you want to lose,
I would steal that board game. I wouldn't even play it.
It was on display at the American Museum of Finance on Wall Street for a period of time. I don't know who owns it at present time, if any individual does, but $2 million seems like a lot to spend for a pile of fake money, although it seems to be a bit more than that.
Can you imagine you're playing Monopoly on board game night with your friends and you're sitting around your table in your living room and someone gets mad because that's what happens in Monopoly and they flip the board over and they're just throwing all these 23-karat gold, ruby, and sapphire pieces all across your living room, screaming at you because you just made them
under the couch,
pay all their rent for landing on Boardwalk, and that you're playing over fake money that's worth infinitely less than the pieces they just threw at you. You imagine how many board games have you owned where you lost the dice to the game, and you're going to lose these dice have pieces of diamonds inside them?
Exactly. I mean, first of all, I guess you'd have to play with people you trusted because, it would be so easy to slip those solid gold houses right into your pocket. I
talk about
guess,
Monopoly as being one of those games that divides friendships. You make someone mad playing Monopoly and all of a sudden they're walking home with your expensive jewelry-encrusted board game.
Yeah, well, if you're going to be a prick with your fake money, well, fine. I'm going to make a couple $1,000s off your game board pieces that I just stole. How's that? So there's also one that I found called the Monopoly Cheaters Edition, and I chose this to talk about specifically because I feel like you and I would enjoy playing this. Not that we're
This is the version I play.
Cheaters,
this is my normal game of Monopoly.
Well, right. We kind of thrive on arguing and debating things and disagreeing, and the main premise of this game is they've written down a lot of the common ways to cheat in Monopoly onto cards, and throughout the game you're assigned them via drawing, and once you're assigned one, you can choose to or to not cheat in the way that you're given, but the more cheats you get away with, the better you do, obviously, and there's also some rewards for cheating throughout the game. But it's kind of like a version of BS, the card game, where if your players call you out, if your opponents call you out and catch you cheating, you get penalized, and obviously don't get to get away with the cheating. So I just thought an interesting twist.
Pays to be a good liar in this game.
Yeah. And then the final one, where Monopoly truly starts to, I think, in a big way, intersect with our theme of world history. I guess untalked about world history. is that in 1941, during the Second World War, the British Secret Intelligence Service asked the game's UK manufacturer, John Waddington Limited, which is a British name if there ever was, for help with a bold plan. Fake charities distributed a new version of Monopoly via the Red Cross to prisoners of war held by the Nazis. But unlike the usual sets, they included genuine maps, compasses, real money, and a file to help the prisoners escape. Apparently
awesome.
with a good deal of success.
How did the Red Cross get into contact with these POWs? Is there anything on that?
I don't know. I don't know the full extent of that.
Seems like this would almost be a plan better set for like Clue, or I don't know, where you have the props that would work into the gameplay that give them little weapons or something like that, or even I don't know, a city-specific version of Risk where you can have maps and things like that. But Monopoly is a pretty interesting way to go with it.
Well, it just surprises me, and I would love to look this up a little bit more and learn more, but it surprises me that a group like the Nazis would be so laissez-faire about what was being delivered to their prisoners of war. You know, I would expect, maybe love letters or, care packages, but if I started seeing more than one or two editions of Monopoly go through the door, I'd have a question mark on my forehead and really start to investigate why so many people were interested in playing this game.
Plus, how many versions
especially
of Monopoly
when they started
do you really
getting
need?
out. Right.
So
Right.
you talked about some of these more interesting versions of Monopoly, but I mean the kinds that we see a lot are things like living in Ohio, we see Buckeyeopoly a lot, or
Sure.
things like that. Do you know what is one of the more popular special edition versions of Monopoly?
I couldn't find a lot of data on popular ones. There's a one that has kind of a cult following, which is a Super Mario Brothers version, where, I mean, of course, all the gameplay is pretty similar, but all the graphics are completely different.
Yeah, for sure.
There's also, I mean, there's dozens of movie versions. There's a 007 series that is pretty popular, and people actually collect it because there's several different versions for, of course, each 007 movie. But I couldn't find specific data on which one is the most bought. I would venture to guess the original one, but
Oh, of course, yeah.
yeah.
It's interesting.
And
Just interesting the makers of Monopoly are finding ways to capitalize and make a buck on their game that is based on the same premise.
I mean, I looked in our game cabinet. My family alone has the original game, Lord of the Rings Monopoly,
Of course.
Steelers Monopoly,
Of course.
a Star Wars Monopoly,
Of course.
and those are just the ones I know of. I mean, my sister might have them. Just me alone and my parents, three of us, we have 4 games of Monopoly. We rarely play them these days, but
I've only ever played really the traditional Monopoly that everyone knows, but I remember as a kid being so overwhelmed and confused by the mortgage cards and all the houses and hotels and everything that I grew up playing Monopoly Junior, which instead of paying $500 for a property, you paid $1 through $5, and just a lot simpler version, but it teaches kids the basics of the gameplay. We even had a CD-ROM computer game of it that we would play Monopoly Junior, and then as you get older, you start to learn the basic game rules and figure out ways to manipulate them to torment your friends.
There are, I didn't mention it, but there are a lot of different computerized editions, from full regular board gameplay to, they even have little handheld ones that are almost like an old style Game Boy that are like, black and white pixelated, and it's like you buy one property at a time and its value increases. I mean, I didn't look into exactly how those are played. Because
I'm sure there's all kinds of
computer,
phone apps and things like that you could play that way as well.
And of course, the nationally popular McDonald's Monopoly.
All right. The big promotion.
I actually just thought of that, yeah.
That might be an interesting story in itself, some of the people that have kind of gamed that promotion to make their own riches out of it, but maybe we'll research that for a future episode.
Yeah. But anyway, a couple other fast facts before we get on to the stories, which I think are really quite interesting, and in our debate, which I think will be even more so. The longest game on record, of course, it's known for being an exorbitantly long game, which is, I think, one of the reasons it's also known for pushing people's patience with their fellow game mates. because usually these games last late into the night until most people are just begging for it to end.
They've had enough.
But the longest game on record actually lasted 70 days.
Sounds about right. That's how it feels
70
when we
days.
play.
Yeah, and I mean, they had people there to deliver food and actually a sort of a rotating team so that people could use the restroom. But
Did they sleep?
70
I mean, they
days.
had to. You couldn't possibly be playing a game for 70 days with no
Well,
sleep.
I think that's why they had the rotating teams, of course. But I also just wonder how, right? Like eventually somebody starts dominating stuff. Did they intentionally, go back to losing, or did they just start with a fuck ton more money?
Now, I'm sure you're going to get into some of the house rules and things like that, but I've played versions of Monopoly where I've, been out front as the one who, owned all the properties and stuff, and had, I think at one point we were playing with a group that I had all the properties, but another player had just hordes of cash that he got from playing, and ended up using his money to bail out some of the other players when they would land on my properties, and it just kind of worked into like the typical capitalist versus the welfare socialist, and in
You were a
the
real estate
end the
mogul, he
capitalist
was a
wins
banker.
out, of course, but that definitely made the game take longer when you have one person that's bailing out the people who can't afford their own rents and mortgages and things like that.
Yeah. Well, that I think is another one of the kind of intriguing parts about the game is that I don't feel that there's just one way to win and dominate. I mean, there's definitely some pretty solid, surefire strategies, but
For sure.
I've seen people play in so many different ways that it is kind of, I mean, it does offer you a chance to be a little bit creative. So something else I found interesting is that based on statistical probability, the most commonly landed on Monopoly Square, which is kind of random, is Illinois Avenue. If you don't count jail. Jail, of course, is vastly more common because there's so many different cards and factors that end up sending you to jail in the game. But because you have to roll doubles, when you leave jail, odds are you're going to hit one of the orange properties, which follow them. And from there, you're most likely going to hit either Illinois or B&O Railroad, which makes B&O the third most commonly landed on space after jail and Illinois. And because everything sends you towards go, that is the fourth. There were a couple interesting house rules I found, and there's been several public forums online that have formed to try to get these added, to the point where Monopoly actually made a house rules edition where they collected some of the most popular house rules, which are, and I'm sure most people, or many people at least, are going to be familiar with these, as I've played with almost all of them. But the first is the free parking jackpot. I've almost always played with this feature. It's basically, and you are familiar with it too, where any time as a result of the gameplay, outside of rent, you're required to give up money for a fine or to get out of jail, or whatever you may need to pay, it goes into this community pot where the corner space, I believe opposite go, is free parking, and if you land directly on that, you get your jackpot.
Yeah, I think maybe that's a local thing, but a lot of people that I know play that version. It might be one of the more popular house rules. I personally don't like it because I'm very much a traditionalist with, I don't like all the free money going out to someone else when I'm not the one getting it, of course. But I know we do typically play with a rule like that just because it does make it more interesting. It's almost like hitting the lottery in the game of Monopoly.
Yeah, it does offer, I mean, it offers a kind of unfair, purely chance-based, way of making money. But also, I think, especially for people who have fallen behind and are starting to feel like there's no way they're ever going to get back into the game, it offers this almost like beacon of hope where, like, if I can just get free parking, I'm going to make...
It's the government bailout of Monopoly.
Yeah. I can't afford to, invest any money, but I buy lottery tickets every day with hope. Another one that I've never played with myself, but landing directly on go doubles your take and you get $400. Are you familiar with this?
I've heard that one. I don't know that. I mean, in our friend group, we don't typically play that way, but I've definitely heard of that one.
Yeah, and then a third one that I think added to the edition was that you actually have to traverse the entire thing once before purchasing any properties, which is something I've never heard and never played with myself.
I've heard of that too, and it sort of mitigates the person who has the best rolls initially buying up all the properties because they get around the board fast. But at the same time, that person still is the first one around the board and begins to buy up all the properties quickly anyway. So
Yeah.
one of the other ones I've heard is a lot of people play that when you land on a space, you're mandated to buy that space or that property. Other people will play that you have the option, and if you pass on it, it's just still available for anyone who wants to land on it next and buy it, or that it could go to an auction and all the players can then bid on the property for whatever value they're willing to spend on it. And I think we typically don't play with the auction with our friends, but that was one that I always thought was interesting or made it sound fun because you could tend to get more expensive properties at a bargain or buy properties that you yourself didn't get the opportunity to land on. But, our friends aren't... we all play with different strategies. I think you and I are typically more the aggressive players, but other people would just be like, I don't want to bid on it. So we tend to not play that rule.
You can't be non-aggressive and play Monopoly. I mean, you could in one of Magie's versions, but
you can play it if you don't want to win it. If you want to win Monopoly, you got to be aggressive.
I also feel like we have some friends who their goal when playing is to get out as fast as possible so they can stop playing. Because we've probably made them play.
We ruin board games for our friends.
Yeah. And then another one that I found interesting, one last house rule, which was actually part of Magie's initial vision. And I think that's probably where it stems from. But it's that once you go around the board 5 times, you can start going in either direction based on your dice roll.
I've never heard that one.
I don't know how that works with the Go thing. Theoretically, you could just sit there and go back and forth across Go and just get $200 over and over and over again.
That's a good point.
That also leads you dangerously close to constantly landing on Park Place and Boardwalk, which $200 is not going to cut it. But it's an interesting kind of twist. It also, I think, would lead to everybody just circumventing Park Place and Boardwalk if no one had bought it yet to try to get it.
Or just always going the opposite way when you land on a property that you'd have to pay rent on.
Exactly. Next up, we're going to talk about the 2 possible inventors of Monopoly and discuss whether or not both or one of them truly deserves credit for the game's invention. But first, a short break. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. So we've spent about a half an hour talking about the history of Monopoly and the culture around it. And now we're going to get into a couple stories about its invention and how they kind of intertwine and connect to one another. Interestingly enough, I didn't even know Charles Darrow's name when I started researching this, except for his relationship to Magie. And as I said before, to restate, Charles Darrow is the gentleman who's given generally credit for the invention of the game, despite Lizzie Magie's holding a patent from almost 30 years before his for her Landlord's game. But in researching
even so much as his name being printed in the box of Monopoly, right?
Yes, yeah. He was actually included in a handout that was included in the game, giving him credit and explaining his story, which is, as you'll see, it's kind of a cool story too. But it was funny. I didn't know his name. I was researching fast facts after reading about Magie and kind of ran into his story over and over and over again. And if you don't type Lizzie Magie's name in, it's almost hard to find her. There's a couple news articles that have similar titles to, what we're discussing today. It's like the true inventor, but the unsung inventor. But Charles Darrow's story comes up numerous times over and over again as this is the inventor with no mention of Magie. And it's an interesting, from sources I would expect to be pretty solid on that. But his story, if you're not familiar with it, goes a little something like this. So he, as many people were, was unemployed just after the beginning of the Great Depression, the stock market crash in 1929. He was an unemployed salesman after he was laid off from a company selling heaters. That was his main job. He invented things on the side, living in Germantown, PA. After he was laid off, he struggled doing various odd jobs to support his family.
His story, honestly, at least his humble beginnings, reminds me of Ray Kroc from McDonald's. We mentioned McDonald's connection to Monopoly with its promotion, but Ray Kroc, who is not the true founder of McDonald's. Maybe that's a future episode. But he's the one who really took over the McDonald's brand and made it into what we know today. He was also a traveling salesman who really struggled and kind of failed at that job until he found sort of his niche and is credited with being, the founder of McDonald's, even though he's really not.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things, like hard times kind of breed these opportunities for people to recreate themselves or create things that'll, end up taking off, that they're really just doing at the time to either pass time or survive. And one of the things, Charles did to pass the time, and this is, again, this is a bit conflicted once we get to Magie's story, but in Charles' official story, as he remembered his summers in Atlantic City fondly, he spent his spare time reconstructing the streets and adding buildings and landmarks as the game formulated in his mind at his kitchen table. And at that time, I don't know that he was, himself, if you believe his story, going for a Parker Brothers sale. But,
humble beginnings, of course. He's the inventor and needs his story to be told.
Right. And so after he invented this game, his family and friends quickly caught on, and they started gathering nightly to play, of course, buying, renting, and selling real estate as we do and know today. And the game was alluring, of course.
Can you imagine having nightly game nights with your family or your friends and playing
not killing
Monopoly?
them? Nope.
Like, I love board games. We both do. That's what we do is in our friend groups is play board games. But how many times can you sit and play Monopoly with your friends and family before you're just over it?
Not every night. But again, we're talking about the Great Depression here. It was something,
That's true.
But I think, people who didn't have wealth, and it's one of the reasons people enjoy the game, people who didn't have the wealth enjoyed being able to experience spending vast amounts of play money as frivolous as I think they imagined, people much richer than they did. And I think they also enjoyed the chance to, kind of go after friends and family financially too, in a way that was, in real life kind of victimless, but also fun. Soon enough, the game became popular enough that friends were asking for copies of their own, and he began selling them for about $4 a piece.
And was he making them himself?
At that time, yes. Yeah, he was making them out of wood scraps and paint scraps and various materials.
What would be $4 at the time? Today, that's about how much?
It's actually about $80, which I thought was kind of shocking. I'm
trying to think of an equivalent. Like, what board game today? Board games are not cheap. If you buy, Cards Against Humanity,
No.
that's probably $60 a deck or something like that, at least for the starter set.
Yeah,
that's sort of on par,
yeah.
but at the time, seems like a lot of money for a board game.
It does. But it was also, I think, for the day, a pretty novel form of entertainment. You think, we spend $50 easy on a PlayStation or Xbox game. And like you said, the really popular party games and board games like Cards Against Humanity are kind of up there. But I agree, $80 does seem. I go to the game store and I'm like, $40? What? Why?
For something that you play once, you hate your friends, then you leave it in your closet for a couple years.
Yeah.
Until you want to try again.
Yeah, man, it just seems like a lot for that time, especially. Right after the stock market crash, people are shelling out $80 for a board game just to escape their money woes. So obviously the game gained popularity quickly, and he began offering it to Philadelphia department stores. But orders increased to the point that he couldn't keep up with production, and he decided to try to sell the game rather than going into the manufacturing himself. Obviously to avoid, he could have, I suppose, saved money until he was able to purchase or pay workers or purchase machinery, but he was more interested in just selling the rights. But initially, Parker Brothers turned him down. In hindsight, I don't know that they would love this decision. It's kind of like the recording studio that passed on the Beatles, but
Blockbuster passing up on buying Netflix.
Yeah, but they explained that the game contained 52 different fundamental errors. The biggest of which were that it took too long to play. Surprise. The rules were too complicated, and there was no clear goal for the winner.
Well, you think 52 fundamental errors might be the reason that we have so many house rules today. People trying to fix their own problems by creating new rules.
Yeah, for sure. And it's kind of wild. Like, what was his game like? It took too long to play. It takes too long to play now. It takes 8 hours to play. What
Or 70
what were
days.
What were they doing? Exactly. What were they doing? Like, they gathered nightly? Did it take all night? When did they sleep? So, I mean, it's just kind of wild to consider that they dropped him initially because it was too complicated, and then released the version that we know of. But eventually, he became successful enough at selling the games at Philadelphia department stores that they reconsidered their offer, and they negotiated the rights to the game and to market it, allowing for them to create an alternate set of rules to simplify it a little bit. So consider that
now.
The next time you play Monopoly, you're playing the simplified version. So obviously, these royalties over time made him a millionaire. And a few years after his death in 1970, Atlantic City, the city that it's based in, erected a commemorative plaque in his honor, which stands at the boardwalk near the corner of Park Place. So the two most expensive properties in the game.
And that's fair. You know, we're here saying that Darrow may not have been the true inventor of Monopoly. I mean, we haven't gotten into Lizzie Magie's story yet, but if Darrow was the one who brought in the Atlantic City tie-in, I think it's appropriate that they honor him with some kind of monument, especially at the two most notable streets of Monopoly, or most notable streets of Atlantic City, I guess.
Right. Yeah. So that's Charles Darrow's story. So now we have Elizabeth or Lizzie Magie's story. She was born in rural Illinois, so she's a fair bit older than Charles Darrow, in 1866. The daughter of an influential newspaper editor and political advocate who had actually traveled with Abraham Lincoln as he debated Stephen Douglas. So she had a pretty active, powerful father, and that bled over in the way he raised her.
Probably influenced some of her connections and ties, too.
For sure, yeah. I mean, and in those days, of course, as we'll get into, the place of a woman in society still wasn't as solidified as it is today, and she had a fairly difficult time, gaining respect and getting even the patent for her game. But for her time and place, her father's influence on her really did have an effect in the direction she took in life and the kind of the emotional and intellectual power she held.
It's also worth talking about that at the time period where we are, Abraham Lincoln is a very notable Republican. And when we start to talk about Magie's political leanings and things like that, the Republican Party at the time was considered the more progressive of the two parties.
Exactly.
It's a very contrast to what we know today as the Democrat Party being a lot more progressive and some of their ideology as far as women's rights and their own, can't think of the term I'm looking for right here, but the parties themselves have really shifted their own ideologies. So Lizzie having that connection, at least through her father, to Abraham Lincoln, probably influenced a lot of her own political beliefs, even though Lincoln is known as a Republican compared to what we know today.
Yeah, I mean, she was an incredibly progressive woman, both in her view of women's rights and advocacy and economically, of course. One of the prominent things she actually did, aside from the invention of the game, was she was a prominent women's advocate, and one of the biggest stunts to her name is that she offered herself for sale in an advertisement as a young woman American slave to the highest bidder, which
this is interesting to hear because she's a white woman at a time where slavery is still, we're talking about the age of Lincoln where we're trying to move past the point of slavery, but to draw that comparison as a free white woman to slaves at the time is pretty drastic. That's pretty stark and notable.
And I think maybe that was her goal. I also think maybe at the time it probably wasn't in a weird way seen as taboo to use that comparison as it is today. I can't really speak to that too much. I obviously wasn't there and I haven't read too much about it.
So nobody canceled Lizzie Magie after this? It wasn't trending on Twitter?
Not quite, no. But I mean, her goal was, as a woman's advocate, to display the limited options for young women, which in this case, she really intended to display that the only option was marriage, the only viable option. They could work as secretaries or stenographers, but those weren't well-paying jobs, and there was really no viable route for most women into higher paying or more influential positions, aside from finding a husband who was either higher paid or influential.
And did she get any offers on her advertisement? Did she get any takers proposing marriage?
I wanted to find that. I couldn't find anything out. I mean, it did garner enough attention to get supporters to pay attention to her. And she actually said, as I said, to supporters that the goal of her stunt was to make a statement about the dismal position of women, stating, quote, "We are not machines. Girls have minds, desires, hopes, and ambition." And the interesting thing is that, not surprising, I suppose, if you understand American history, but that this even needed said, that this was probably a progressive statement. Girls have minds, desires, hopes, and ambition.
What?
Like, yeah, I mean, it's wild that needed said, and it kind of points to, I think, maybe the reason why offering herself as a slave wasn't seen as kind of that drastic, because women's position really was a lot, worse off than they are today. I mean, they hadn't gained the right to vote yet. Like I said, there were only
African American men were granted the right to vote before women.
Yeah. So it was in no way I don't know what word to use, a cakewalk. It was not a pleasant, I suppose, existence for women like Magie, who had those hopes and ambitions and desires of her own, to do more than just be a wife and raise children.
Right.
And of course, she stuck by that. She didn't marry until the age of 44 and supported herself almost the entire time. As I mentioned, two of the things women could be were a secretary and a stenographer, and she did both of those, as well as writing poetry and short stories. She also performed comedic routines on stage, which was another thing that was kind of wildly unknown for women to do.
I'd love to see some examples of that. Like, I want to know what her show was like.
I wish there was video camera. Yeah, right. So I mean, I think it would.
I mean, even that advertising herself as a female slave kind of probably has some comedic end to it as well.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean,
at least satirical.
It certainly is.
Sarcasm.
I mean, it's irony, it's satirical, it's sarcastic in a way. I also am kind of interested to know what comedy was like back then. Like, we know what stand-up comedy is now, but
probably a little different. In
the late 1800s, I feel like it was a bit different. I couldn't find any examples of her writing, unfortunately, outside of, the quotes given about her game and the patent that she wrote. But she did actually, about 20 years prior to inventing Monopoly, invented a typewriter invention that basically allowed the paper to move through with more ease. So Monopoly wasn't her first go of it, and she clearly had a diverse set of skills. But obviously her biggest achievement was her board game, The Landlord's Game, which at its base was, for her, an expression of her strongly held political beliefs, which, like I said, were very progressive economic beliefs. She drew a lot of the inspiration for her game from economist Henry George and his book Progress and Poverty, which was published in 1879. He was an intellectual who believed that individuals should own 100% of what they made or created, but that everything found in nature, particularly land, belonged to everyone. And kind of on that basis, he advocated for a land value tax, also known as the single tax, the general idea of taxing land and only land rather than property that could help shift the tax burden towards wealthy landlords of the time and off of the common man.
Now, can you go into the land value tax a little bit? I don't know how much you've researched all this, but I'm a tax expert myself, but for those listening that may not fully understand it.
Aren't we all? I spent a fair bit of time trying to understand this, and I'm sure there are economists out there that could explain this far better than I, but essentially if you take two plots of land, both an acre, one is a vacant lot. Another is a lot with, anything built on it, a structure, an apartment building, a business, whatever. Let's make it an apartment building for simplification. Both are worth $100,000. The house, or the property, the building, is worth $300,000. So we have a total of $500,000 between the two. So let's say in our city with these two lots, the total value of property and land is $500,000. So tax at 10%, we're looking at $50,000. That has to come from somewhere. So obviously the person who has the property and the land and the building is going to pay 4/5 of that. They're going to pay $40,000, and the person with just the land is going to pay $10,000 because they only own $100,000 worth of stuff. That's under the property tax that we know of. And one of the reasons why we do that is just because we've always done it. It's that classic American thing. We've always done it. Technically, I mean, a lot of economists think that the land value tax is the smarter option, and I'll explain why. So let's say we don't tax the property at all, the building. We just tax the land. Now both are paying $25,000 in taxes equally. Now what this does is it encourages people to improve their properties first, because under property tax, the more you improve your property, the higher its value goes up. And this is bad for you if you want to save money on taxes, right? One guy was paying 4 times more than the other guy just because he had a building instead of a vacant lot. So it encourages progress. It encourages urban development. It encourages, landlords to create better living conditions instead of just letting their buildings get more and more run down. And it encourages also in a supply and demand field, people with vacant lots who have no desire to do anything with them to sell them to other people, because there's more people that want to do something with that land, and thus the demand for it will go up.
Maybe not so beneficial to the farmers or the rural property owners, though, who might own a ton of land that doesn't have as much construction on them as it would be to, say, an apartment
not necessarily
building owner in a big city.
But the thing is, when you think about that, it actually didn't do too much. I mean, because urban properties were so much more expensive, it had a bigger effect there. Rural properties generally had much less value attached to them. And in an area like that, the density of structures is pretty much the same, give or take. I mean, you're right to an extent, but this actually ended up helping rural folks a little bit more than it helped, urban developers, especially wealthy ones. I mean, wealthy ones got penalized. Another thing you need to understand, and I'm sure this still happens today, but a common practice of the day was to buy land as if you were buying stock and do nothing with it. You just buy, you don't plant crops, you don't build housing. You literally bought land and waited for its value to appreciate and then sold it again. It made this it made this hugely, it made it basically economically undesirable, because you were paying way more for just that. I mean, you were paying the same amount for that base land as you would getting people to pay your rent.
So it was beneficial as long as you're using your land rather than letting it sit vacant.
Right. It's beneficial if you're the biggest thing about it is that it encourages more and more efficient building and housing and business lots. It encourages efficient and more progressive development, so that dilapidation and then the other thing that comes with that is that everybody's property values go up. If everybody's developing and improving their lots, the property values go up instead of vacant. Yeah. Well, of course. But anyway, I don't want to bore everybody with a giant economics lesson, but of the day,
People don't like hearing about land taxes.
This was seen as
back to Lizzie.
Well, and she actually included this, and we'll get into this. This was the land value tax was a prominent rule, if you will, of her game. But of course, George and folks like him, including Magie, weren't super keen on folks like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, and her game was kind of a response to their enormous wealth. For those who don't know a lot about them, they were both extraordinarily wealthy business magnates. At the turn of the century, Rockefeller founded the Standard Oil Company, which ended up being broken down into, ExxonMobil. I mean, basically the largest...
He was the Bill Gates of the time before
there
was
was
software.
They controlled, the Standard Oil Company controlled 85% of the U.S. oil, which was what made it a monopoly in the eyes of, the U.S. government when they had the antitrust legislation that was passed, and what broke up Standard Oil into different oil companies like Exxon, which are still, some of the most wealthy companies on the planet. So when you consider that his company was broken down into multiple of the most wealthy companies on the planet, it's kind of wild. And he ran the company from 1870 when he founded it until 1897. And even after that, he remained its largest shareholder. At his peak net worth, this is crazy. When we know people like Bezos and Bill Gates, right? At his peak net worth in 1913, he was worth 1.4 billion or 418 billion adjusted for inflation in today's dollars. That makes him more wealthy than Bezos. Twice, almost.
Quite a bit, yeah. Bezos today about 184.4 billion net worth.
Yeah. And what's even crazier is that if you consider not just inflation in dollar amounts, but share of the U.S. economy, Rockefeller made up 2% of the GDP. If you consider that metric, he's 4 times richer than Bezos. So, it's just enormously wealthy men who,
So what you're saying is Lizzie Magie had a problem with things like this.
Absolutely.
People controlling all the wealth.
Absolutely. Well, and one of the things she believed, too, and in her discussion of the game and its implications, is that a lot of social this is 100 years later, we're having the same conversation. A lot of the social problems of her day she saw as direct results of people like Rockefeller holding so much money. The scarcity seen at the bottom was, for her, a result of, Rockefeller and Carnegie holding enormous amounts of wealth. And Carnegie, similar situation, founded Pittsburgh's Carnegie Steel Company, which ended up being U.S. Steel after he sold it to J.P. Morgan for over $303 million, which helped him surpass Rockefeller as the richest American for several years. He landed at about $375 billion, which still almost twice as rich as Bezos. Yeah, it's a stupid amount of money.
Poor Bezos is a little... he's feeling poor right now.
Yeah, it's just an enormous amount of wealth. Generations of their offspring were still the richest people on Earth. For several generations, it was. And we of course know their names because there's dozens of public, facilities and parks and spaces that are named by them. And of course, they did do, to be fair, their fair share of philanthropy and gave away a lot of their wealth, but. If you believe Magie and George's position that they created enormous disparity at the bottom of the ladder because of their wealth, then their philanthropic efforts are kind of seen as more of a Band-Aid and less of just generosity. But anyway, this was her inspiration, one of her inspirations for the game. And so in 1903, she filed a patent for her Landlord's game, which, like I said, is more than 3 decades before Parker Brothers began manufacturing Monopoly based on Charles Darrow's version.
And did Parker Brothers know about this when they were in talks with Darrow to buy his game?
They did. I don't know that they knew when they were in talks with Darrow, but they knew before production because they bought her patent, several of her patents, for about $500 in order to start distributing and manufacturing the game without legal trouble.
Well, that's good for her that she got some recognition, but that's clearly not probably the full recognition that she deserved for this game.
When you consider that Charles Darrow became a millionaire and that for inflation, $500 is just under $10,000 now. $10,000 or $1 million.
So that's peanuts.
Yeah, it's nothing. It's even today I would be happy to get it, but it wouldn't even really be a life-changing amount of money in a lot of ways. So the biggest, I think, mark of her game, which clearly displayed her goals, was that it had 2 sets of rules, an anti-monopolist rule set and a monopolist set. Of course, a monopolist set was a little bit closer to what we know today, where the game is to dominate. The game is to win, to collect as much money as possible, and the rules that she created for that set made that easy. The anti-monopolist set was very interesting, and like I said, it kind of all centers around that land value tax. So to get into the rules of her game, the board setup was similar to what we know today. There were 22 lot tickets, supposed to be labeled green. Interestingly enough, instead of, rolling dice and going around the board to get things, players drew from the pile until 12 were drawn total, and then you could choose to purchase them or not. After all 12 were either bought or replaced, the game would begin. So people started the game already owning properties. Of course, her game did Of course, her game did include the railroads of different names, but again, this wasn't based off of Atlantic City at that time. It included the water and lighting utilities, but it also included an interesting fourth type of space, which were what she called absolute necessities, and these you had to pay. It's worth mentioning, when you landed on the lot tickets in her game, you could, or the lot spaces, you could choose to rent the space, which, I mean, basically your money's out the window. You could choose to buy it, and then you would receive the rent, or you could do neither and just move on. But the absolute necessities, food, fuel, shelter, and clothing, you had to pay. Now, of course, it was less than the lots were worth, but you still had to pay these. And this is important to understand later, because that starts to have a big effect when you consider the land value tax. So let's get into that. The anti-monopolist set basically instituted this land value tax, where in addition to paying rent to people who own the spaces, every time you landed on a space, including if you landed on one you owned, you had to pay into the public treasury, as she called it, a land value tax. I believe it was only $5, but every time you landed on a lot, it was $5 to the public treasury. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and this is how the anti-monopolist set benefited everybody, and that was her goal, was to show that in the Monopoly version, one person wins and everybody else loses, and in the anti-monopoly, everybody wins. Because as the public treasury hit $50, it purchased the water and lighting utilities, and those became free. So when you landed on them, nothing happened. And then, again, you paid into it until it hit 50, and then it started purchasing railroads. Every 50, it purchased railroads until the railroads are free. And then it did this with the necessities, the food, the fuel, the shelter, the clothing, until everything but the lot spaces were just free. And then after that, every $50 it went up, it made the go space $20 bigger. At the time it was $100, but after 50 it would go to 120 and then 140. So eventually, I mean, the more people pay this land value tax, the more, in the game sense, the public, the government owns necessities and utilities and things like that, and it's thus free to the people. And you're really just left with buying and renting properties, and you keep getting more and more money from pass and go. So everybody just keeps getting richer and richer, and it doesn't create this funnel into doom. Now, I don't understand how you win this version.
I was going to say, it would be interesting to play this game in comparison to Monopoly, to play both versions. But it really seems like with this land value benefit, the game would take forever.
Well, I don't think
There's
it really
so much less ways for people to run out of money. I mean, in theory, people would eventually run out of money when they start landing on properties or lots instead of the utilities and stuff that's paid for. Because, I mean, like life, you're going to have necessary expenses, even if a lot of your needs and utilities and everything are taken care of. But, I mean, the game would definitely take longer for one person to accumulate all of the wealth and to drive the others into bankruptcy.
Yeah, and I mean, I've thought about this a bit in researching how it worked, and I mean, obviously the game was created as a teaching tool, and that's like her anti-monopolist set was not intended to be an end game. Like I mean, I suppose her intended reaction would have been eventually, wow, look at us all doing great. Let's be progressive economists.
But to play the devil's advocate here, and this doesn't need to be a long argument back and forth, but you know, the common objection to this would be that one person who's landing on the utilities is using up a lot more of the necessities. Landing on all the necessity spaces and the utility spaces, they're consuming all of the resources. And it's not fair that all of the other players have to pay into this and pay out their benefit. It has to get to $50 that everyone's contributing to that money to pay for the one person who's consuming all the resources. Right. And that's a lot of the argument that we hear today. So it's not a utopian system. No, it would definitely take longer for everyone to run out of resources eventually, or run out of finances eventually. But at the same time, you are still having the people who can afford it funding the resources for the people who can't.
Absolutely. And again, I think this is just my personal opinion, but the threshold, the kind of line in the sand in the completely free market and socialist argument is, do you believe that the government's responsibility is to take care of all of these life expenditures for people? And in another way, it's kind of a moral question in that, do you believe it's your responsibility? Because the government's not going to pay for it magically. You're going to pay the taxes like you just said. So I think you get back to this place where, do you believe that it's your responsibility to ensure, whoever doesn't have to pay for the railroad, doesn't have to pay for the lighting and the water. And I think that's another, every single argument about that, it can be healthcare, it can be utilities, it can be food, it can be shelter. And I think there's a new argument to be had with all of those, and what should be a right and what should be a worked for and earned privilege. But
so what was the reaction like to some of her more progressive ideas coming from the game like this?
At the time, I don't know a whole lot about the political reaction. Of course, she was, this is not, of course, to downplay her invention, but she was a woman creating a board game in the turn of the century. And of course, didn't even get credit for it until the 70s. So I don't think it was seen as a political force. It was very popular, though, among progressive liberals, and especially younger progressive liberals. It ended up being a folk favorite among left-wing intellectuals, particularly in the northeast part of the country, schools such as the Wharton School of Finance and Economy, as it was called at the time, Harvard University, and Columbia University. So it became popular. I think the anti-monopolist part became popular with those groups. But, of course, as we know, the monopolist set is more fun. And it became more popular and more in demand.
It's more fun if you're winning.
Yeah, I think, well, of course, yeah. But I think she understood that it like I discussed during Darrow's story, it provides a context where you could lash out at your family and friends financially in ways that you can't in life, or most people, I suppose, can in life. And she understood that it had a kind of dramatic potency of kind of role playing outside of one's normal everyday experience. And it really was. That is why I think the monopolist set kind of took off as the more popular part of the game. And why I anticipate that the anti-monopolist set probably didn't have a definite ending, which is why it was kind of harder to play on a regular basis. In addition to being really popular, though, at all of these business schools and Ivy League schools, there's a community in Atlantic City referred to as the Quakers or Friends, which is a religious movement. If you're not familiar with them, a quick note on them. It was a branch off of English Christianity. They were founded in England in the 17th century by a gentleman named George Fox. They were persecuted for their beliefs. Being a bit progressive for the time, they believed in the idea that the presence of God existed in every person. They rejected outright elaborate religious ceremonies, so fairly humble rituals. They didn't have an official clergy, and they believed in spiritual equality for men and women, which was the big one here, and why I think they caught on to the game as quickly as they did. So because of this, they were, part of both the abolitionist and women's rights movements to a pretty big degree. But I think that's, really why the game took off with them. And in Magie's, I suppose, historical version of the story, and this, of course, isn't her version, it's the one that was written about her, but in this version, the Quakers developed the Atlantic City version, which Charles Darrow was taught to play and decided to form his own version of and sell.
So Darrow stole it from the Quakers.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. Her identity was, as I said, kind of hidden for a while until it was discovered by accident in 1973 by an economics professor by the name of Ralph Anspach. And he was trying to make his own anti-monopoly game when he discovered her patent and kind of switched gears and began a decades-long battle to kind of discover the truth of what he called the monopoly lie. And that's how her story began to get told. But, I think after 40 years today, even now, with all the internet that we have, the Darrow myth is still out there. Obviously, I said I ran into it dozens of times with no mention of Lizzie in the article. So, and in looking at both of the games, there are some differences. Of course, the anti-monopolist rule set is completely thrown out in Darrow's version. He also was the one that created the houses and the actual house pieces, and that's where the common, or I guess the modern design, aesthetic design of the game came from. The Landlord's game was vastly different in its aesthetics, but concept-wise was pretty much the same.
So you've obviously read up a lot on the history of both versions of this. Do you believe that Darrow really stole the game from Magie, or did he kind of invent his own version that was just similar to the ideas that she had? I mean, obviously, it's striking how similar the games are, but the idea of proposing the model of capitalism in a way in board game form isn't that unique in its own sense.
Yeah. I think I don't think Charles Darrow was like a bad guy. I don't think he like found Lizzie's game and was like, I'm gonna sell this for so much money. I think he was taught it as this kind of folksy, round the table after dinner game that he hadn't seen on shelves. And it was 30 years after Lizzie created it, and obviously her story hadn't been thoroughly told. If anything, it was told by word of mouth, hand-me-down myths through dozens of levels of people. So I think it was probably more likely that he just was taught this cool folksy game that wasn't in the market and decided, I'm doing really poorly as a unemployed heater salesman doing odd jobs for my family, and let's see if I can take this off the ground, especially after, he's created his own. I mean, whether or not I guess the biggest contentious point is, did he create the Atlantic City version or, get it from the Quakers? But either way, after seeing how popular it was, I don't know that we can really fault him for wanting to take it to Parker Brothers.
This really might be more of a commentary on, society at the time, that Lizzie may have had the original idea for this. And obviously it was a very complex idea, complex game that would be hard to even put together and sell. Like, even Darrow's version had 52 fundamental arrows and was too complicated, but
Yeah.
it seems like her version was even more complicated. But to even give the credit to a woman, and an outspoken, progressively political woman at the time, just might not have been accepted.
Totally.
And Parker Brothers itself wouldn't have been wanting to take on that statement of having her as the face and the founder of the game. Not to say that that's right, that she shouldn't be given the credit for it, but that probably had a lot to do with why Darrow is known as the creator of Monopoly and not this other woman who would have been more polarizing for them.
Right. Yeah, and I also wonder, like, she was offered about, in that time's money, $10,000. How much did she know about Darrow? Did she know he had already sold this other game to them? Or was she just like, wow, you guys want to buy this for $10,000? Sure, this is just a folksy thing I made 10 years or 30 years ago. Like, I think, for me, just what I've read about her, I think if she knew the full story, she would have been a little bit more feisty and fought back about it. Like, I don't think she would have just kind of off and sold it for $500. She probably would have at least talked up the deal a little bit. But again,
she may not have known what it would have turned into.
Well, of course,
implications of her game beyond just a fun experiment that she had with her friends or things like that.
Right. And she also probably wasn't interested in becoming a millionaire, given her views, which is another position that's given a lot in terms of like, why didn't she come forward sooner? But, I think it's kind of important for people to know. And, we've talked a while about this, but I think it's good to wrap up with one of her preferred quotes, which was from a Henry Georgist publication, Land and Freedom, in their 1940 edition, which sums up, I think, her view of politics and her view of economics and advocacy and activism, and one of the reasons why she made the game. Basically, what is the value of our philosophy if we do not do our utmost to apply it? To simply know a thing is not enough. To merely speak it or write of it occasionally among ourselves is not enough. We must do something about it on a large scale if we are to make headway. These are critical times, and drastic action is needed. I don't know if creating the board game Monopoly in her mind at the time would have been considered a drastic action, but given the game's enormous cultural applicability and popularity, I think it's important that people know that it was born with her, whether carried through Darrow or not, because it does kind of carry her legacy of wanting people to understand the economic powers at play, even 100 years later.
And this was a way for her to kind of speak out in a more subtle way that might be accepted by more people to create a game that displays the way she felt that the political landscape should work.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it definitely, I think, speaks in, like you said, in a way that people are going to understand better than her standing on a podium yelling about her views ever would have, even today. So
you ready to test out your knowledge of Monopoly?
let's do it. I mean, I've talked so much about it that I don't know what else there is to ask, but hit me with what you got.
We'll be right back. We just want to take a minute and thank you for listening to History's B-Side. You know, it takes a lot of time to research and put these episodes together, so we wanted to let you know how you can support the show going forward.
Go ahead and subscribe at anchor.fm/History's B-Side, or wherever you're listening from. If you'd like, leave us a review and tell us what you think of our show.
If you're interested in advertising with the show and hearing your message in a spot like this, send us an email to historiesbside@gmail.com.
We're looking forward to hearing from you, and thanks for listening.
All right, so we like to end every episode with a short little quiz to test out our host's knowledge of his subject and also just give you guys a little bit of interactive way to see how much you know about the topic already. So I have 3 questions for you. I'm going to ask you 2 specifically about Monopoly and 1 about Lizzie Magie. You ready?
All right. Yeah. Let's do it.
So, well, first of all, what piece do you choose? What game piece do you choose when you play Monopoly?
You know, I like the dog. I like the little Scotty dog.
It's probably the most popular one, at least
Usually,
of the people that I know. So, your question, how many of the original 10 pieces in Darrow's game can you name? The original 10 game pieces that you could choose from to play as.
Oh, man, the original 10. I mean, I know at some point they changed, but I believe the original 10 were... and I don't even know if these were Darrow's, but we had a battleship, the top hat, the Scotty dog, a boot, a race car, either an iron or a cat. They replaced the iron with the cat at some point. And, shoot, there's one more. Thimble. There's a thimble, too.
So you got 6.5 of the original 10. Because it wasn't a boot originally, it was a shoe.
Dang.
But
All
yeah,
right.
you got a
boot,
lot
shoe,
of the,
dear God.
you got a lot, especially the ones that have still exist today. The battleship, the top hat, the race car, thimble, the shoe turned into a boot. The current game pieces that we have that aren't in the original ones are the wheelbarrow and the cat.
The wheelbarrow.
But the original game pieces that you didn't mention, or at least I don't know if you mentioned the iron, there was a purse, a lantern, a cannon, and a rocking horse were some of the ones in the original game. There's been a lot of
mentioned the iron, but
there's been a lot of pieces that have changed in and
I
out over the years. There's some special versions. There was an elephant at one point, a money bag. So the pieces have changed at times. And I remember it being a big notable thing when the cat became a piece. But there were 10 original
there's actually
game
a
pieces,
T-Rex now.
Is there really? That's
I was looking at some of the newer pieces, but there's a T-Rex now. There's a couple goofy ones that I don't even know if I like. I like the kind of folksy old.
All right, so we'll move on to your second question. This one is more about general board game knowledge. We talked a lot about Monopoly. Monopoly is the 4th best-selling board game of all time. Can you name the top 3?
Oh my God.
And I'll give you a hint. These 3 have a significant head start on Monopoly as far as their invention.
Oh, Lord. One I'm going to say, not number 1, but one of the... Do I have to name them in order?
If you can name them in order, that'd be more impressive. But I'll let you guess them.
I'm going to say Sorry.
Sorry is not in the top 3.
Dang, I've seen it so many places. The Game of Life?
That's probably top 10, but it's not in the top 3. These are way more obvious than what you're thinking.
Risk?
Also top 10, but
Is that a...
not more
Dang.
popular than Monopoly.
I'm honestly not sure. Outside of this, I mean, chess, does that count as a board game? Chess and checkers?
Chess is number one. Chess was invented in
Okay.
1200
Okay.
AD, or around. These are obviously just based on historical findings and similar versions of the game. Chess is the newest of the top three. The other two are both
Okay. Oh.
early versions of the games were discovered in artifacts from around 3000 BC. Number two is
Lord.
checkers. And number three, backgammon.
See, yeah, you're right. I was thinking way too like more
Specific
modern,
and new
like,
age, yeah.
legitimate board. Not, I guess, not that they're not legitimate, but
All right, so
All
we'll
right.
go to your last question. This one's more about Lizzie Magie. In 1910, Parker Brothers published a humorous card game invented by Lizzie Magie. Can you name it?
no, I can't. Dang, how did that not come up?
The game was called Mock Trial, and it sounded really
No.
interesting. It was a card game, and it would be really good for a party, like a big group. I think I found an advertisement for it, which if we get a website up and running, or maybe on our Instagram, we will post this article on here, or this advertisement for it. And it says it could be played from 6 to 20 players, I believe. And basically it assigned people roles. So you were either the judge, the prisoner, lawyers, witnesses, and everyone else would just be a member of the jury or something like that. And all the cards were humorous. Your roles were kind of funny, and it gave out the story of the trial. But I don't know, it sounded fun to play. You'd have to basically litigate your trial
Yeah.
and see if you want to prosecute the prisoner.
Yeah, I'd be interested to get my hands on that.
We'll have to look that up and see if we can find a game of mock trial. Or if you're listening and want to send it to us, if you find it somewhere, we would really appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, it's been a fun hour and a half. We spent a long time talking about Monopoly. Just want to thank you guys again for listening. Hope you learned a little bit today and enjoyed finding out the true story of Monopoly's invention and are inspired to pick up a set and play with your friends or hate them or whatever you do when you play Monopoly sometime soon.
Matt and I are going to go play Monopoly after this, and we'll see if there's an episode 3 following this one.
I'm going to need another beer if we're going to do that.
Thanks for listening.
History's B-Side is an independent, listener-supported podcast.
Leave us a review or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service, and follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at History's B-Side.
Send us your feedback or inquire about sponsorship and advertising opportunities by emailing us at historiesbside@gmail.com.
You can support the show by visiting anchor.fm/historiesbside.
This episode was researched and produced by your hosts, Matt Melito
And Phil Hall. Thanks for listening to History's B-Side.